And now joining us out of Bristol is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, for more on the story. Hello, Tony. Hope you're doing well out there. Seems like the Yemeni forces are carrying out and getting more sophisticated and shooting deeper into Saudi territory on these retaliatory strikes. Your thoughts, how that's going to impact the balance of power there, the balance of this aggression?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how the idea of the Saudi airstrikes is so normal, we never even hear about it on the news here in the West. And yet, as soon as something like this happens, it's considered to be an extreme act. Of course, it's not. It's actually just simply retaliation for this constant by Saudi Arabia of the Yemen, which has left, now we're talking about 100,000, according to Amnesty International, and other aid agencies have pooled their resources. They reckon 100,000 people have now died, almost, well, most of the majority of them civilians, in particularly in the epidemic of typhoid, which ripped through Yemen. And that's because the infrastructure, not military, it's the infrastructure of the country that's been being attacked, as well as the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Yemen by the Saudis. Now, the only reason that they're allowed to get away with this is because there's no coverage of it, virtually zero, here in the British press. And if there is coverage, or in the Western press generally, but I can just talk about here in Britain, this conflict covered, it's considered to be inevitable somehow. And isn't it sad that so many children are starving and ill, dying, and yet there's no interest whatsoever in the causes of this? And the major cause is that because it's the Western arms companies that are driving this conflict. We've got a whole load of Royal Air Force personnel still over in Saudi Arabia, helping them and training them to do these bombing raids. In a way, it's kind of training for the British in war. And so that's why I think this conflict has dragged on such a long time, alongside these other forms of tension over in places like Ukraine, the Caucasus, the South China Sea. And I think, to be honest with you, most of the powers like China and Russia are looking at the West as basket cases, hell-bent on war, particularly in the Middle East, in support of Israel. And so they're thinking to themselves, well, there's no point in having trade relations, or very little point in having trade relations with these people if they're just going to continue to bomb their way to the negotiating table, or even not bother to negotiate.
Right. And Tony, why has London been in such conflict with itself when it comes to supporting the Saudis with weapons? You know, you hear so many voices and so much entertainment of ceasing the arms sales to the Saudis, but then you see them, I mean, at times you think you're on the precipice of a moratorium, and then you see business as usual the next day. Why is that the case?
Well, it's called hypocrisy. Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about, oh, isn't it terrible? Was for a short time calls for halting arms sales, but the lobbies of the arms industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the City of London, the banking fraternities, these are so powerful in Britain. And also, of course, the key factor is the media is not doing its job in calling these criminals to account. They're involved in these absolute decimation of the poorest country in the whole of the Middle East. And really what's going on with Yemen, if you look at the history of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen was for a very long time part of Saudi Arabia. Yemenis are associated with the Saudis very closely, and the Saudi royal family is extremely this is a very fragile top-down structure that doesn't have a lot of support. And so they're worried, quite rightly, that the Yemeni part of the Saudi peninsula is going to be one of their most troublesome spots, the people that won't do what they're told. And look, in the background of all of this, you've got a guy called Anatoly Antonov, right? Now, we don't hear much about him, but was the Russian ambassador to Washington. 2 weeks ago, he was withdrawn back to Moscow, and we've heard almost nothing about this in the Western press at all. This is the first time in history we've had this kind of withdrawal of a Russian ambassador from Washington. Even at the height of the Cold War, the Russian ambassador still stayed there. There were all sorts of arguments and tips, even including, by the way, the world being on the brink of nuclear war in 1962, but the Russian ambassador stayed in Washington. Now, for the Russians to withdraw their ambassador, there's clearly something very, very wrong with bilateral relations with the United States. It seems to me that they have basically painted themselves into a corner militarily by kicking out where they should be trying to join hands with and trade with other nations, because they see their status in the world falling to virtually zero as the Chinese and others outcompete them. And so rather than try and play a fair game, they're trying to fight their way towards resources, to territory, and to take over rather than to negotiate. So we're dealing really with something equivalent to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And I'm not kidding when I say that, because it was the Nazis that were countries willy-nilly, like Czechoslovakia and Poland and places like that. The United States has been doing exactly the same sort of thing with Iraq and Afghanistan. And then when they won't leave, otherwise, you know, they conquered the place, got rid of the so-called bad guy, but they still keep hanging around. And so that's why I think we're in this situation with Yemen, is that the only way that this kind of atrocity can be allowed to carry on, and of course we've got to see some striking back by the Yemenis. Of course you have, when you've got this bombing campaign from the air, cowardly bombing campaign from the air going on, mostly with British munitions and British jets. And that's the way we're going to have to play it now, is to look to see some way of negotiating this peace, because if we don't, then with the Russian ambassador no longer in, the world is actually getting towards a brink, which if it goes off that brink, it will be almost impossible to pull it back. But the Americans don't seem to care. And I'm not just talking about the Americans, I'm talking about NATO in general. And if we had a decent press in the West, they would be calling our leaders, so-called leaders, out for this brinksmanship, which is pushing East and West back into a far worse state, actually, than even during the Cold War, with the potential of the sort of conflict that we, you know, nobody in my lifetime has actually seen. So we need to get these people back round talking again. But the Americans apparently are not ready to do deals. They think they can control the world's public opinion through the media, and I'm afraid that is a very dangerous way to take, because when we do go over that brink, then the whole of the public will be totally against any such conflict.
Always great to talk to you, Tony. Thank you. Do stay safe. From Bristol, Mr. Tony Gosling, their investigative journalist.